Good morning. For those of you on the webcast, we will be starting in a few minutes. Thank you.
Morning, this is Jim Behrman, panel liaison.
And
Court,
Sacramento is ready, and then we'll
on the
start.
line, Court?
Oh, Jim, is that you?
Yes.
Okay. Are we ready to go?
Let's begin just to see who we have in terms of panel members on the line. I'll just read down the roster. Dr. Hammond?
Present.
Court, you're on the line, yes?
Yes.
Dr. Landolph? Dr. Landolph will probably be joining us. Dr. Glantz?
He's just outside the room. I just told him he has to come in.
Okay. Dr. Ritz?
Yes, I'm here.
Dr. Blanc?
Yeah. Here's Dr. Lance. Will you say you're present, Dr.? I'm present.
He is. Dr. Glantz is present. Dr. Besseratinia?
Here. Good morning.
Dr. Miller?
I'm here. Good morning.
Good morning. Dr. Kleinman?
I'm here.
Excellent. And do we have Dr. Landolph? Okay, hopefully he will be joining us. As I said, this is Jim Behrman. Here in Sacramento, we have
Dave Edwards.
Melissa Traverso.
Beth Schwer.
Yeah.
and we also have Claudia Nagy from our legal office, John Boudreau and Darren Dodge from OEHA. Denise, what was your last name? Thank you, from ARB. And let me also, Court, just take a minute to introduce Lori Miyasato, who is going to be replacing me as the panel liaison. I've told her she did not have to say anything this morning, but let me just briefly, to introduce her, summarize that she has a bachelor's degree in biology, a master's in zoology, and a doctorate in animal behavior from UC Davis. She's been with including her time as a graduate student, she's been with the Air Resources Board for over 15 years, the last 13 and a half years in the research division. She's been a research contract monitor. In fact, some of you may know her from her working with you as principal investigators. She's the lead staff person in reviewing air pollution neurotoxicity, and she's been coordinating the Air Resources Board's comments in reviewing the National Ambient Air Quality Standard documents.
Well, it's Paul Blanc here. I just want to say that her expertise in animal behavior should be useful in dealing with the panel.
Well said. Well, welcome, Lori. We're thrilled to have you join us, and we look forward to working with you.
Thank you very much.
And I will be sending out a more complete biography of her for your information. So with that, Court, let me just check one more time. Dr. Landolf, are you on the line? Okay, hopefully he will be joining us. Court, let me turn the meeting over to you then.
Okay, great. Thank you, Jim. So we have one main agenda item today. We're going to really get an update of...
Hi, Joe Landolf joining.
Welcome, Joe. So I was just going over the agenda. So we have one main item today. We're going to continue our review of the proposed updates to the chemical list in Appendix A of AB 2588, air toxic hotspot submission, inventory criteria, and guidelines regulation. So we're not there in person to chide you to do this every time, but please be sure to speak into your microphone when you talk so that the court recorder can get your words, and also so people listening on the webinar can hear you clearly. And with that, let's go to agenda item number 1. So if you remember, the June 28th meeting of 2019, we received an informational presentation from CARB about the program. And then on our last in-person meeting on October 4th, 2019, CARB staff presented a draft proposed changes to the chemical substance list in Appendix A of the regulation, including a description of the selection process used in reviewing over 1,300 substances, which they did in consultation with OEHA and DPR. So you will remember we received 4 different documents at our last meeting, and we discussed those documents at the in-person meeting. What we're going to do today is discuss the summary of the comments drafted by CARB staff about our meeting, and then talk very briefly, I believe, about some public comments that we received. 2 days ago, we received comments from the American Chemistry Council, and staff is reviewing the comments, but because we have had not much time since we received the comments, we're just going to get a short response from them, and then at our next meeting, they'll give a more detailed response to the comments. We also received comments from another group just yesterday, I believe it was, so those comments will also be reviewed at our next in-person meeting. So Beth Schwer, the staff air pollution specialist, and Melissa Traverso, air pollution specialist from the Air Quality Planning and Science Division, will be leading the staff discussion today. I believe the panel received the 2-page document, labeled continuation of the SRP review of the draft proposed updates. So Melissa and Beth, I believe, will be going over that document. So Beth, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Thank you, Court. I'm going to let Melissa start this, and then we'll tag team this.
Okay, sounds great.
Thanks, Court, for the introduction. We'd like to kick off the continuation of the panel's review of the draft proposed updates to the AB 2588 Appendix A list of chemical substances by going over some of the key points that we presented at the June 28th and the October 4th scientific review panel meetings. We'll then present a brief update on the work we have conducted to address the panel's comments and recommendations and go over the next steps and anticipated timeline. As you may recall, at the June 28th SRP meeting...
Excuse me, this is Stan. If there are any slides, we're not seeing them. We're seeing like fog and deer and water on the beach.
Dr. Glantz, this is Jim Behrman. There are no slides. There are just, you would have received the 2-page,
Okay.
It's titled Continuation of the SRP Review. Do you have that?
Okay, yeah, we did get that. But if there are no slides, I'm going to turn the computer off because watching these deer walk around is very pretty, but it's kind of distracting.
That's fine. And also, let me mention for the benefit of persons watching the webcast, both sets of comments received from the American Chemistry Council and also the 2-page handout, the one that we're referring to right now, all of those documents are posted on the Scientific Review Panel webpage. And with that, let me turn it back to Melissa.
Okay. So at the June 28th SRP meeting, we provided you with a presentation in which we informed you about our plans to update the emission inventory and criteria guidelines regulation. A key piece of these guidelines is Appendix A, which provides a list of chemical substances that may pose chronic or acute health threats when present in air and which must be reported as part of a facility's emission inventory. At the October 4th meeting, we presented the proposed updates to Appendix A chemical lists and asked for the panel's input in the form of 3 questions about any important chemicals missing from the proposed list, the functional groups being proposed by CARB for the inclusion on the list, and whether any chemicals on the not proposed for inclusion list should be added. I'd like to refer you to the handout that you received yesterday as we provide an update on the work we have conducted to address your comments and recommendations. Our first question was, are we missing any important air toxic chemicals from the proposed list? The panel suggested that we check American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists, ACGIH, values for chemicals to be included. We reviewed the ACGIH list of substances having TLV values as suggested by the panel. We confirmed that we had already accounted for many of the ACGIH chemicals, either on the existing Appendix A list in the emission inventory criteria and guidelines, or being covered in our proposed updates to the list that we have shared with the panel. We identified what additional substances there are on the ACGIH list, and we are continuing our evaluation of whether any of these should be included in our proposed updates to Appendix A. We noted that there are a number of pesticides among the additional ACGIH substances, and for pesticides, we have already been working with the California Department of Pesticide Regulation, DPR, to add the pesticides that are registered for use in California and which have reported usage in the pesticide use reports. So we aren't anticipating that the ACGIH list would result in many new pesticides. We have found that there are some other substances on the ACGIH list that may warrant being added to our proposed update. We're still in the process of evaluating these in consultation with OEHA. As one example, we noted that ACGIH includes another hexavalent chromium-containing compound that had not been previously addressed. Likewise, the panel suggested that we check the NIOSH list and the Kent-Olson handbook. And the panel also suggested that perhaps the recent Environmental Health Perspectives article by Baru, Paul, and Fine could be helpful as a cross-reference of many chemicals. We have reviewed the NIOSH list and have found that there may be some substances that have not yet addressed in our review process. We plan to work with OEHA to review these substances to determine whether or not they meet our evaluation criteria to add to Appendix A. The Kent-Olson handbook, as well as the Environmental Health Perspectives article, include many oral poison, specialized chemicals, and pharmaceuticals. Many of these may not be relevant to the AB 2588 type of facility reporting, or may not meet our evaluation criteria regarding recognized toxicity and the potential to be airborne in California. So we are continuing to consult with OEHA to evaluate both the NIOSH and Olson lists. The panel suggested that all IARC Group 1 and Group 2, 2A and 2B chemicals should be on our list. So staff confirmed that all IARC Group 1 substances have been included on our lists, either under Appendix A1, A2, or A3. In addition, we have reviewed all the IARC 2A and 2B substances, and they have been included on our list if they meet our selection criteria as mentioned earlier. The panel also asked that we expand cobalt to consider both insoluble and soluble forms. The answer to this is yes. Our plan is to align with OEHA's new structure of the cobalt health values, including both insoluble and soluble forms. In addition, the panel asked us to consider adding rare earth metals and metals used in catalytic converters. Based on the SRP's suggestion, we will likely propose to add a number of rare earth metals and metals associated with catalytic converters. However, we don't anticipate that there are likely to be many cases of facilities subject to the AB 2588 hotspots program who would need to report them. The panel suggested we check the EU REACH chemical list regarding restricted chemicals or that achieve a certain status. We had previously considered some chemicals from the EU REACH list, and based on the panel's suggestion, we have reviewed the EU REACH chemical list more thoroughly. We have identified and added all the persistent and bioaccumulative toxicants that we think would be of concern in California, and we are in the process of evaluating some of the other substances of concern on the restricted chemical list. Moving forward, the panel suggested we consider adding carbonyl compounds that are used as flavorings for vaping. In our review, we found that many of the substances associated with vaping are aldehydes. Many aldehydes are already on the existing list, and we have further reviewed many additional aldehydes and have evaluated a number of individual ones to be added to our list. However, based on our review of the available literature and our consultation with OEHA, it appears that not all aldehydes or related carbonyls can be considered to be necessarily toxic. So we are not anticipating we would want to add a broad general group for aldehydes, but rather continue to address individual chemicals of concern. And of course, we are open to any further guidance that the panel may have. The panel also suggested we consider carbon nanoparticles, nanotubes, and nanofibers. We are aware that this is an emerging field that we will need to continue to track. For our current proposal, we have focused primarily on established authorities like IARC in order to decide which nanoparticle-related substances to include. We have added multi-walled carbon nanotubes other than multi-walled carbon nanotube 7, as listed by IARC, to our proposed update to Appendix A1, which is the list for which emissions must be quantified. And we are open to any further guidance that the panel may have. At this point, we could pause for any further panel discussion on this question number 1, and then Beth will continue with discussion of question number 2.
This is Kathy Hammond. Thank you very much. This is very, very informative. I would very much appreciate what you've just said in writing, because there's a lot of information there, and I won't remember it for later, and I was not able to keep up taking notes as you were going through it. So that's the first thing. And then the second thing is, and maybe you'll have this later, I would like to know the chemicals, like if you go back to the ACGIH as one example. I'd like to actually see the listing of the chemicals that you decided were not on the list that you're considering, and then which of those that weren't on the list that you're considering you decided you were not going to put on the list and which you were. So in other words, more of the details. So both what you've said so far and more details by chemicals. Same with the EU REACH chemicals through all of that, if that's possible. So that's my first comment. Do you want to say anything, and then I have a second?
Sure, I think that would be possible for us to provide you with what I just went over in more detail, and then also the list, the ACGIH list of substances that we are considering to add.
Okay, great. And then the second thing is you commented that not all carbonyl compounds are toxic. I'd be very interested in knowing what carbonyl compounds are not toxic. Because I think as a functional group, it is in and of itself a reactive compound. and on what basis you decided some carbonyl compound was not toxic. So if you have some of those compounds, I'd like to know that.
Okay, I'm turning to Beth to see if she knows any particular chemicals.
We'll gather some of our references together. There's a couple of papers that we looked at since our last meeting, and one of them is about the molecular mechanisms of aldehyde toxicity, chemical perspective, and we'll look at some other things.
Well, that sounds very interesting, and I'd love to have you share that with me.
Yeah, so we'll
I can be
we'll be
educated.
consulting.
All of you always educate me, and I just need to continue to be educated. Thank you.
Yes, and we'll consult further with our partners at OEHA and see what we can come up with to give you some information on which ones we're choosing and how we're looking at that.
Thank you.
Laurie, this is Mike. Two questions. One is, when you looked at the ACGIH list, did you also look at the list of understudy compounds? These are compounds which are not necessarily in the book yet, but are being considered for a guideline. And the other question is related to the catalytic metals. Are there facilities in California where they process these catalytic metals, especially to reclaim, the precious metals that are in them?
This is Beth. We are, let me address the understudied compounds question. I think we focused primarily on the list from ACGIH that had TLB values. We can go back and take a look at that. I wasn't as aware of the understudied list. We'll go back and look at that. On the catalytic converters, one of the things we were thinking would have a concern would be the metal scrap recycling places, that sort of thing. But our understanding is that because they are pretty valuable, most of the catalytic converters are taken off before cars are crushed and that sort of thing. But whether there are any facilities that are actually doing some of the actual processing of those in California, we'll have to double check.
Okay, because with the lead industry, reclaiming lead batteries and things like that has become an issue. And so while we're talking about reclaiming, is there any industry application right now for reclaiming lithium batteries and alkaline batteries and that sort of thing in California?
I understand that there is a growing industry in that. We have some other groups at the Air Board that would be familiar with that, and we'll double check with them about whether any of those facilities are looking like they're coming into California.
Okay, thank you, Beth.
Great, thank you. Any other comments, panel? Okay, if not, Beth, you want to continue with number 2?
Thank you, yes. All right. So the second question was, are the functional group characterizations for emerging chemicals appropriate and adequate? Are there other functional groups to add? The panel's feedback on this question was that the functional groups approach is a good idea. In addition to the 3 proposed functional groups, the panel suggested that staff explore whether to include some possible additional groups, and we'll summarize our thoughts so far on these. One was suggested freons and other fluorinated chemicals. We have already included as one of our proposed functional groups many subclasses of the per- and polyfluorinated substances, and we also include many individually listed fluorinated substances. We're continuing to review these types of chemicals, including the freons, HCFCs, and related fluorinated chemicals. It's our understanding that not all freons or other fluorinated compounds necessarily have toxicity concerns that would warrant their inclusion. So creating a functional group class for the freons and other fluorinated chemicals may be too broad and may not be appropriate. Many CFCs, HCFCs, and HFCs are covered by bans and phase-outs as well, such as the Montreal Protocol. So rather than a functional group approach, we have covered individual freons and fluorinated chemicals that have recognized toxicity per the source lists specified by AB 2588. Going forward, we will continue to explore and track this topic and, of course, are open to your suggestions. Methylating agents were another suggestion. We explored the possibility of adding this class as another functional group, but it appears that the exact chemical structure of each molecule can greatly affect the electrophilic properties and the availability and strength of the methylating character, and hence its toxicity. It appears it would be very difficult to adequately and clearly define a group to address those with methylating potentials warranting concern. Instead, we have reviewed additional data for individual known methylating agents, and we do plan to propose adding several of these to our Appendix A update list. Some examples include iodomethane, methyl triflate, diazomethane, methylfluorosulfonate, among others. Aldehydes were another suggestion. We've talked a little bit about them just now. Many aldehydes are already individually listed, and we explored the possibilities for a functional group approach for the aldehydes. But from what we've seen so far, the available research and structure activity tools indicate that the overall molecular structure strongly affects the toxicity of the aldehyde, and the mechanisms are not understood yet well enough to clearly and straightforwardly define a class or subclasses for those that weren't concerned. So at this time, we've taken a chemical by chemical approach for considering aldehydes for proposed inclusion on the Appendix A list. We will continue to track the state of emerging data and tools. Epoxides and other reactive chemicals in epoxy mixes were also suggested. We considered a functional group approach, but there appears to be many complications that might not make it feasible. There are many epoxides that are metabolic intermediates. Epoxides may be generated from emissions of things like PAHs, but the epoxide itself is not the emitted substance that's used or released from the facility. At this time, the most feasible approach appears to be inclusion of specific substances or resin systems that are identified as having toxicity concerns per the source list specified in AB 2588. Some examples include bis 2,3-epoxy cyclopentyl ether and Epicote 1055. Going forward, we will continue to explore and track this topic, and in particular, we are interested in data on any stable epoxides used in industry. Other categories of PAHs, for example, nitro-PAHs or polycyclic aromatic quinones, were suggested. We address many individual PAHs as well as various substituted and pH derivative compounds already on the list, and we are proposing to add others. Simple group headers can also be useful to organize closely related chemicals together for display purposes on the list in order to provide context. For example, it can be helpful to organize the various individual nitro-PAHs together when listing them. However, from the available data, not all polycyclic aromatic chemicals can be presumed to have toxicity warranting their inclusion on the list within a broad functional group type class. We have proposed one PAH-related functional group for inclusion, which covers any polycyclic aromatics containing a halogen atom, chlorine, fluorine, bromine, or iodine, because anything in this class can be reasonably expected to have toxicity concerns warranting inclusion. In our reviews so far, we have not been able to identify any other subclasses that appear feasible for a functional group approach.
Beth, can you say something about strobins?
Yes. Strobins, which include the fungicides used in purple drywall, were also suggested. We are considering adding individual examples of strobins. However, we have not found adequate data for us to define a broad functional group class at this time. You want to pause here for questions on comments on question 2?
Yes, please. Panel, comments?
So, Paul Blanc here. I think your comments point out that there are two ways that you can inform your process by functional groups. And I think one of them is, as you've alluded to, is using the functional group as a red flag for you to identify individual chemicals that you're going to list individually. And I think that's perfectly appropriate and that's fine to do. So, for example, if in your review you find that something is a methylating agent and it's a potent methylating agent, it would be a criterion for you to then consider it for listing, assuming it meets your other criteria, such as it gets into the air and it's used in the state and so forth. And the other flip side of why when you should think about functional groups is in areas where you anticipate that industrial modification of materials is so rapid and changing that it's not going to be possible for you to get a list which is going to be sufficiently inclusive. That is to say that you may have a list of what's in use as of December 1st, and March 1st, there's going to be a new one you could anticipate. So in the list as you go through it, I think that's worth thinking about. And of all of the ones that you've just gone through, and none of which are feasible in your assessment to use as a functional category, I think the one that I wonder about most would be the freons and other polyfluorinated materials, because those, I understand your point that they're not all equally hazardous and that some of them are being phased out, but that is an area in which things change industrially. And I'm not contradicting your decision not to have it as a functional group, but I'm saying those are to me, the two sides of the question you should think through. I have no problem with doing it chemical by chemical if it's feasible to do, and that's probably cleaner, as long as you don't think that there's such instability in what's being manufactured that you're going to have problems. I mean, that's your rationale really for the isocyanate functional group, which you are retaining, as I remember. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So that's a great example. Isocyanates, every week they come up with some new variant isocyanate. And for a lot of them, in fact, that's been a problem why NIOSH doesn't have recommended levels for many of them, because they just haven't kept up. And that's a good example where the ACGIH does have criteria for some of them that actually NIOSH doesn't. So this is an observation. It's not a directive in any way. It's just what I think would be a useful way of organizing your thinking going forward.
Thank you. That's very helpful, and we will continue to really look at that.
Other comments?
Yeah, this is Stan. I have one, just to tag on to what Paul said. If you're trying to make this list looking forward, you might have a sort of secondary list of things which are not currently being used in California, but that if somebody starts using them, you want to know it. So you don't go through the whole effort of coming up with risk numbers, but something that, could potentially be toxic. If it's introduced, then at that point it might be subject of more careful scrutiny. I mean, we're seeing this in looking at how the FDA has been handling toxins in e-cigarettes. They have a list of bad things in cigarettes. So what the tobacco companies are doing is engineering the products to avoid things on that list, and then but in the process of doing it, a whole bunch of other bad things are being increased. So I think since these people do look at these lists, in terms of making management decisions. And so just to have something that might be a potential concern if they start using it might be a good thing to at least put industry on notice of. I agree that you don't want to go do a full-blown analysis of things that aren't currently in California. But if something's coming, it would be good to know it.
Thank you, Stan. Other comments?
This is Mike. I was just thinking that compounds like the HCFCs were created because they react in the atmosphere and don't reach the stratosphere. What do we know about derivatives of some of these compounds? And it may be that even though the parent is not very toxic, a derivative might have more toxicity associated with it.
We're going to bring John Boudreau from OEHA here.
Good morning, Dr. Kleinman. One thing you want to remember when talking about this is you're looking at chemicals that are likely to be emitted in California. If you're talking about a derivative, well, that's something different. Technically speaking, it's not something that's going to be emitted from a facility.
That's an interesting question, though, John. I mean, if the initial emission is not toxic, but it makes a highly toxic product in the atmosphere, that could not be regulated under 2588?
That could be, but where I'm going to is more, without having that kind of information in mind, at what point do you make the list so large? You say you haven't given Freon. How many different degradation products can you have, and do you list all of them?
Yes. Yeah, I mean, it definitely makes things more complicated.
Isn't that the whole rationale for the functional group approach? Maybe I'm missing it. But my understanding was so that they didn't clutter it up with a gazillion variant things. For certain functional groups, they would just say, if it's not otherwise listed, but it's got this functional group, you have to behave accordingly. But maybe I misunderstood the whole goal of the functional group approach.
This is Beth Schwer. No, that's correct, Dr. Blanc. And yes, I think to some extent we would definitely consider that if something is emitted, but it does form something else, we could certainly consider that. We'll talk more with our legal folks about it, but I think that that's something that we've in the past thought that would be true. I think it's a balance here. We have to try to figure out what we can do, and we'll also dig more into some of the data about these particular compounds and just see what we can come up with, and we'll consult with John Boudreau further about this.
Thank you, Beth. I have one suggestion for a possible functional group category, which is peroxides. They're used as radical initiators in a lot of industrial processes, and at least some of them have toxicity. I don't know if there's enough uniform toxicity across the group that you could list them as a functional group, but it's at least worth considering looking to see what is emitted and what the toxicities are of some peroxides.
Great, thank you for that suggestion.
Any other comments on item number 2?
This is Mike. Just one other thought in terms of aggregating. Sometimes we could look at things, in terms of categorizing them on a specific biological response. For example, compounds that are respiratory sensitizers. Which may be sort of the critical endpoint, and in determining what would be allowable. And it might be useful to see if things that are fall into this category of respiratory sensitizers could somehow be a way of aggregating and coming up with something, a common level that might be helpful.
Thank you for that suggestion. And I will say that as we've been evaluating chemical by chemical during our review, if we saw any evidence of sensitization as one of the endpoints, we definitely gave that chemical high priority.
All right, thank you, Mike. Any final comments on number 2? If not, let's move on to number 3.
Thank you. Our third question was, are there any chemicals on the not proposed for inclusion list that should be included in one of the Appendix A's? The panel suggested we consider a wide vapor pressure range for substances that might partition into the gas phase or otherwise become airborne. We have definitely tried to take this into consideration during our case-by-case review throughout our chemical substance review. We have not limited inclusion based on applying a rigid vapor pressure range. For example, we have included some solids where there may be a mechanism whereby it could become airborne, such as through fugitive dust releases.
Sorry, continue, Beth.
Do we just continue? Okay.
No, sorry. Anything else on 3 that you were going to say?
That was all I had for that.
Okay. I think this was my comment in the meeting, and it came about because I think you had still being listed on the not proposed for inclusion, and I thought it was because the vapor pressure was considered to be too low. But I think still being probably has a sufficient vapor pressure that it's still going to get airborne in a facility and still get emitted potentially. And then maybe it'll partition to particles in the colder ambient air. So that would be one specific one I would suggest you look back at.
Thank you. We will.
Blanc here.
Okay.
Yeah, so I was just going to say your general approach, I think, is wise, and even in addition to that, I would say that aside from solid particles, scenarios that are very likely to generate liquid aerosols would equally be appropriate. I mean, I think that Kathy could comment on this in greater detail than I, but this has been a big issue with isocyanates, which have been promoted by the industry as being not a big deal because they don't vaporize, but unfortunately, most of the activities that they're used in very effectively generate aerosols. The issue of the vapor pressure out of context is almost irrelevant.
Yeah, this is
I think you said it well, Paul. This is Kathy. You said it fine.
Thanks.
And I totally agree with you.
Yeah, this is Mike. One of the things you might look at when you look at the ACGIH list, they have a category, when they set a guideline, they also specify how it is to be determined. And they've developed I don't know how good it is, but a rule for determining which compounds will have some appreciable exposure potential as a vapor and as a particle. So if you look at the notations on the ACGIH list, it'll have IPV, inhalable particle and vapor. And that may be a good way to flag some of these compounds, that might have a vapor component to it.
Great suggestion. Thank you. And I will add, we also, when we were reviewing individual chemicals, we would look at the usage that is expected and predominant for those chemicals. And if we saw things like it's used in a hot environment, like a classic one is something that would be used on sprayed on a hot automobile engine, for example, that kind of thing we know would volatilize. So yes, we're thinking of those things, but these are excellent suggestions for some additional systematic review.
Any other comments about 3? Okay, if not, let's move on to 4.
Okay, the fourth question was that in addition to providing input on our questions, the panel also offered other general comments. So I'll go through some of these, and I'm going to group a couple things here. Why not include cardio and pulmonary toxicants as a separate category? And it would be good to see the existing list broken down into the same categories that we were showing for the proposed lists. And we might want to consider including other organics as a category. In response to these 3 suggestions, I want to say that it's important to revisit our original reason for categorizing the substance list. In order to facilitate the review of this rather lengthy list, we heard suggestions to identify some key types of categories. Some were regarding types of health outcomes of particular interest to the panel members, such as cancer versus developmental effects versus neurotoxin effects. Some were regarding types of chemicals, such as metals and other inorganics. And some were regarding types of uses, such as pharmaceuticals versus pesticides. It was not our intent to try to provide a comprehensive framework of all types of effects and categorization. For example, for health effects, our main focus was on simply tagging the effects that are officially identified by some of these source lists from which they were derived. For example, flagging the Prop 65 cancer and DART categories, which are assigned under Prop 65 itself. For other types of effects, such as cardio and pulmonary toxicants, none of the source lists provide an authoritative categorization of that, and we ourselves do not have expertise in making those categorizations. The panel also suggested that we add columns for the health outcomes, the chemical types, and source lists, and the panel indicated they would like to see the list combining both the existing and the proposed new entries. In response to these requests, we are in the process of creating and populating columns that do flag and categorize the key health outcomes and the types of chemicals that we've discussed. Columns were already included in the source lists for the source lists where the chemicals come from, as well as available information regarding the predominant uses of the new substances. So we are working on extending these features to both the existing and proposed new substances. We're also currently working on combining the existing Appendix A list with our lists of proposed new additions. This will facilitate the review process and provide context with the overall list. The process is time-consuming because careful integration also involves resolution of any seeming duplicates with overlapping substance names and any seeming duplicate or conflicting CAS numbers. The panel also suggested we may want to look into cannabis-related emissions. We learned at the recent CAPCOA symposium that the cannabis extraction processes can be quite large and quite similar to other big industrial processes that use large quantities of certain solvents for extraction. Any of the toxic solvents used in the extraction process are generally already reportable on our existing Appendix A. The actual grow houses are considered as agriculture by most air districts and would not generally be anticipated to be subject to AB 2588 applicability provisions. And while most end uses involving personal smoking or vaping would generally not be subject to AB 2588 facility applicability, we are considering the possible addition of environmental cannabis-related smoke and environmental cannabis-related vapor, analogous to the current Appendix A1 listing of environmental tobacco smoke. So before I discuss the next steps and timeline, I want to pause here for additional discussion.
Paul Blanc here. I think it's fine. I think the reason why there were comments about the categories is that it wasn't entirely clear, hypothetically. Suppose something wasn't a carcinogen and wasn't a metal and wasn't otherwise listed, but it was caused, acute lung injury. Would it not appear at all? In other words, conceptually, was there a category of other, not elsewhere classified, which you would only have to use if you hadn't already to avoid, busy work. if there was something which just didn't fit in very well anywhere else, because if it's already a metal but it causes lung injury, you don't have to create some separate listing for lung injury. So just remind me, because I don't have the list open, how are things handled which you want to list but you can't categorize in one of your existing categories, or has there not been such a substance?
We would have put them into our master list, so you would definitely see it in the combined master list. But for the panel's review, we had then subdivided them into sub files that we provided that were just the carcinogens, for example, on request by the panel. But we had another file that we called other at that point, just to make sure that you would see everything.
Okay.
The master list definitely had everything.
Good. Well, I think that's fine then. And what you might want to do also internally, not to make as part of a document and not even to share with us necessarily, but just for your own conceptualization, is make for yourself some kind of Venn diagram so that you have a sense of how much you think some of these things are overlapping or not overlapping. Just that, if it was helpful to you. I don't need to see it, but I think that's where some of these comments came from. We were thinking in Venn diagram terms and couldn't get our arms around it necessarily.
Yeah, I mean, I actually think that is a good idea because, I mean, there are a lot of air pollutants that do have cardiac toxicity, which people don't really appreciate, for example. And, you know, probably less so for pulmonary, but I think we want to keep those endpoints visible. I mean, we don't need to have the same thing listed in 7 different places, but taking those endpoints into account in the analysis, I think how you do it is up to you, but I think it's something that you do need to be considering.
Well, if they have these columns, this column check thing, then it will be there.
Right. I don't have the whole list in front of me either, but I don't remember columns for cardiac.
No, you might have to add a column for cardiopulmonary, and I think that's what you said in comments, rather than have not a separate section, but you'd have a column for it.
Yeah, that would be fine.
And bearing in mind that it may not be obvious to you that there is cardiopulmonary toxicity, and then somebody from our group or from somewhere else will say, wait a second, you should also check that column on that substance.
Great, thank you.
Any other question for comments? Okay, if not, Beth, you want to talk about next steps?
Yes, thanks. So I'd like to address the next steps for the review of the Appendix A list of chemicals. After we have satisfactorily addressed the panel's comments and recommendations from the October 4th and today's meetings, CARB would like to request a letter of support or a similar document memorializing the panel's general approval of the proposed updates to the list and any additional directions provided to CARB staff at these meetings. CARB staff would then initiate the formal rulemaking process to amend the emission inventory criterion guidelines regulation, and we will apprise the panel of any additional changes arising from the public process. CARB staff may request a final letter of support if there are substantive changes to the Appendix A chemical list. And the anticipated timeline for these next steps would be as follows. The panel would provide an initial letter of support by, say, February of 2020. We expect to start the public workshops on the emission inventory criterion guidelines regulation updates in spring of 2020. We anticipate taking the amended regulation to the board in late 2020. CARB and SRP will revisit the Appendix A chemical list to draft a final letter of support as needed. And that concludes what I had wished to present. Is there any further discussion?
Yeah, I think the letter of support is a good idea, and I like Kathy's suggestion of a detailed, essentially what you said orally today. It would be nice to have that in written form. And then I think based on that and our comments today, we can come up with a letter of support from the panel. I don't know, Jim, do you have any thoughts about that process?
I think your suggestion is a good one. We plan to also meet with our legal staff to assure that the form of the panel's communication is proper.
Okay, good.
Yeah, Jim, Paul Blanc here. I think that was what I was going to ask, is from a regulatory point of view, since this is different than the task of commenting on a proposed document saying that we've reviewed it scientifically and found it to be appropriate, which is a regulatory role that's clear for the scientific review panel. The legal input should be just as you indicated, that what is it actually that we're doing, and how do we make that within the scope of our delineated responsibilities.
Morning panel, this is Claudia Nagy. I'm one of the lawyers here. I can offer some initial thoughts. Because you are a Bagley-Keene state body, only a sub-quorum can meet outside of the public forum to draft the letter, if you wish to do so. And then the draft letter could be presented to the full panel at public meeting, and the panel can vote on or decide to approve the letter. Alternatively, staff can perhaps draft the letter and send it to the panel for review before the public meeting, and that is acceptable under Bagley-Keene as long as we make that letter available to the public at the public meeting. So those are some options, but a quorum of the panel, which would be 5 members, cannot meet outside of the public forum. That would be prohibited by Bagley-Keene.
This is Stan. I mean, what I would suggest is that we follow the protocol we use on on the reports, and that is maybe to designate a couple, 2, maybe 3 panel members as the leads to work with staff to draft the letter. So it's not a quorum, but if you pick like the 2 or 3 most knowledgeable people, which for this task would not include me, because I'm not a chemist.
But I thought curmudgeon was a talent.
Well, that too, but I can do that later. But I think rather than just leaving the staff to do it all by themselves, or maybe just one panel member, I think these are complex issues, and there is a lot of expertise on the panel. So if the chair or the panel were to designate 2 or 3 people to work with staff in drafting the letter, that would move the process forward.
And that would be acceptable from a Bagley-Keene perspective. Yes, that would be.
Yeah, and that's how we've done things in the past.
But I think you skipped what is really my question, is that normally what we're doing is not writing letters of support. We are writing an opinion as to whether a document is appropriate scientifically. That's not a letter of support.
Right. Well, I think that's what we ought to do, is we should actually say we agree this is appropriate scientifically.
When the
So I think the letter ought to be structured the way we do in
findings.
Findings. Yeah, it should be modeled, I think, on our findings letter.
But can we presume that we are empowered to have findings for this process? It's really a very technical question I'm asking, and it's not because I'm opposed to us opining, but I just want to make sure that we're not overstepping in this process what or taking upon ourselves a role which falls outside of what we are instructed to do generally, empowered to do, delegated to do. And I think for that we need some legal comment.
My legal comment would be that findings are not required in this case. I looked at the Health and Safety Code just recently. Formal written findings are only required if the panel is evaluating the health impacts report. So in this case, if the panel wishes to provide a document and call it findings, I don't see any with that. However, formal findings are not required.
But they're allowed, you're saying?
They are allowed, sure.
Okay, that's all I wanted to know.
This is Mike, and this seems like it's analogous to the process we used when we talked about the risk assessment guidelines. We looked at the scientific basis for how those guidelines were established, and then provided findings on the scientific end. So I agree with Stan that this is probably a way that the panel has been comfortable in operating.
Yeah, I think the point Mike is making that this is very much analogous to the. I mean, we've done processed several reports where we developed risk assessment guidelines. There's been 3 or 4 of them, and this to me, and we've done a couple of priorities documents too, and so I think this is very much in that spirit. So we should look to that as the model for what we did.
I guess I also would appreciate input from the panel members on the call who haven't spoken yet today.
Specifically as to what, Paul? As to the nature of the SRP response to CARB?
Well, they haven't commented on the individual things, so I'll let that go. But now we're talking more globally about our role in opining on the scientific process used, and that we will give an interim approval of that. And I personally would want to hear from my fellow panel members who haven't spoken whether that general direction they're comfortable with. Like Michael and Stan and I have, by our comments generally, and yours generally suggested that that's an acceptable way to go. But I think the others, Dr. Ritz, for example, should speak up.
Okay. Other panel members, your thoughts about a findings letter?
Yeah, this is Ahmad. I'm still a little bit unclear about the purpose of this initial letter of support. What purpose it's going to serve? Is it a requirement at this stage?
Dave or Beth, do you want to speak to that?
Yeah, this is Dave Edwards from ARB. It's not necessarily a requirement under our Health and Safety Code statute to do this. However, given the sort of life cycle of how the SRP reviews many of these things, we thought that it would be beneficial to allow you all to weigh in on this list, because it sort of is the beginning of the life cycle for these for the final factors that you do review for the specific chemical compounds. And so given that, as opposed to doing something more informational where we just sort of show you the list, we wanted to have a more broader engagement. And so at the end of the day, this feedback has been very useful that you've given, and we would want to memorialize that in some way so that when we are moving forward, we have something to say in our public process that we did go through this initial round of improving and updating and solidifying this chemical list so that we can use that throughout our public process.
This is Claudia again. If I could just add something, you might wish to maybe call it an initial letter of support in case you make revisions later, or an initial, findings.
Yeah, I think though we could make preliminary findings, but in all the years I've been on this committee, we've never written a letter of support. So I think we could call it preliminary findings if you want it, but I think, what we've always done is, drawn some specific conclusions.
Or actually, interim findings is perhaps more precise.
Yeah.
If we're beyond preliminary.
Hearing all this, I feel it's not the findings we are adopting or saying they are fine, it's the process. And the process is fine.
Yes, I think the analogy that was raised to the process proposed for risk estimation is very parallel, I guess.
Yeah, we've gone through. These are things. In fact, I was the lead on most of them, or one of the leads, where we've developed like guidelines for stochastic risk modeling, which is the most recent one. Another, the process for developing the non-cancer RELs, and so those are process documents rather than a specific, this chemical is, has these risks associated with it. But we did issue findings saying that we think the procedures embodied in the document were acceptable. So I think that we should just, or ARB should just go back and look at those records, and we should just continue through an analogous process. Because as I said, I don't ever remember writing a letter of support. But my larger point, though, is I do think that we need to designate 2 or 3 panel members to actively work with staff in generating whatever we call it, in generating that letter, so that we can have at least some preliminary technical input into the development of the letter before it comes to the panels, to sort of speed the process.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea. Jim, do you think it's good to try to get the leads now over the phone, or should we do that post-meeting over email?
I suggest you do it post-meeting, so that no one is put on the spot in the group forum. And maybe sidebar conversations that in sub-quorum ways we might want to have.
Yeah, I think this is one that I don't feel I would be appropriate because of my areas of expertise are really not, central to these discussions. But I think, the panel does have people with different specific expertises, and, deciding which of those areas of expertise are most relevant to moving this process forward. That's how I would try to select the people to do this, because, we'll get to the public comments, but the industry was not wildly excited about what's going on here. So I think, and we are breaking some new ground, so we want to make sure that we have, the best, the technically most knowledgeable people involved with developing this letter.
Okay, so we'll plan to do it over email. I think that's a good suggestion.
Yeah, this is Joe Landolf. I hadn't had a chance to weigh in yet. I'm generally in favor of the letter with findings and, indication that the panel participated in this process and is in support of the final product, and perhaps any further short recommendations we might have, if we come up with any new ones, is a good thing. So I'm in favor of everything that's going on so far.
Thanks, Joe.
This is Mike. Do we have, or, is there a way, or some sort of formal way that it is decided which of the compounds or groups off of the shopping list will be given priority in developing guidelines and other things? And if so, maybe that would be part of the total package.
John Boudreau, you want to speak to that? John, are you with us?
Sorry about that. Yes, I could. Could you repeat that question?
The question is, there are, decisions that are made as to which compounds are going to be reviewed and, put up for guidelines. And I'm wondering if there are, a way of putting those down in paper that might be useful, and maybe the panel would have suggestions as to how to kind of tune which are the next candidates off the shopping list.
Well, are you talking about candidates for addition to the emissions inventory, or candidates for example, hotspots rail or cancer unit risk development?
Well, I'm thinking more in terms of the hotspots rails and unit risks, but I think it would be very useful to have an understanding and maybe even review the process of how we are going to select compounds of interest and at what degree we want to go after them.
Well, if you're talking about a priority order for AWEA, I mean, there's a lot of judgments that would come in other than, what you've been describing. For example, the air districts have specific interests, and they'll suggest chemicals. ARB has specific interests also, and they'll do the same. So it's trying to say that we're going to take the emissions inventory list and have that be the sole determining factor as far as what chemicals that AWEA is going to start work on. And I've mentioned this in the past, we don't have the capability to do dozens of chemicals in a year. So what you're talking about is discussing how you're going to do maybe somewhere between 4 and 8 chemicals at any one given time. So whether it's really useful to have a very formal process to make those kind of determinations is something I think we need to talk about in more detail.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking in terms of a formal process. I was thinking more of, even sort of a decision tree, just so we all have an understanding of what goes into picking, where you're going to be putting your effort. This is just, one of my areas of curiosity. I don't think it's necessary for, this particular process, but at some point, it would be good to, have a real understanding of where do these decisions come from.
Well, actually, this is Stan again. We actually have weighed in on prioritization several times over the years. And, we don't come down with a do this, then do that, then do that, but, coming up with broad, high, medium, and low priority type lists. And, that this process may be right for us also, suggesting that, although I think we're not quite to the point of doing it. But that could be something to add to the, between now and coming up with the final document that we would sign off on, to not only be the sort of general classifications, but some suggestions of which things ought to be done first.
Okay, well, one caveat I have with that is the more formal of a process you have, the less flexibility you have in that process. And I know that several of the chemicals that have been entered into the hotspots process lately, and I'm thinking of parachlorobenzotrifluoride being one where an air district asked us to look at that. Trivalent chromium that we essentially generated that ourselves because looking at the fact that it's become more and more of a strategy for air districts to control hexavalent chromium emissions, but there was no health data available for it. Cobalt, which was primarily done because of a recent NTP study, you wind up having to react sometimes to information that wouldn't have necessarily been on a prioritization list that you've generated. Especially, like I said, with, it's not like you're doing 100 chemicals a year and you've got some wiggle room. You're doing 4 to 8 tops. And the more formal you make the process of prioritizing what you're going to be doing, the less flexibility you've got when something pops up that you didn't see coming.
Well, no, I understand that, and I'm not talking about a rigid list, but, I think the panel has helpfully, contributed to sort of broad prioritizations. They're not locked in stone, but in saying, when you look at the apparent toxicity and what we know about the levels of exposure, these things are sort of the highest priority, and others are lower priority. But taking into account the fact that things change. But I think that's something to kind of put on the side right now to think about getting to later. I think that there's a lot of stuff on the table before we get to that in this process. But I'm just saying we ought to just put it on the agenda to think about later.
And I agree with Mike's comment, John. Even if you just give us an informational presentation about these are the ways in which compounds rise to the top of the list, that would be helpful to understand. And then if panel members have suggestions about specific compounds, that would only be, these are suggestions. It wouldn't be anything binding for a WEHA.
Well, I don't want to beat a dead horse, but we've done at least 3 that I can remember prioritization documents over the years, and might be useful for OEHA to go back and just take a look at those.
And the fact that very little has ever come out of them,
I don't think that's true. I think they did have an effect. It was mostly pushing things up. Not saying there are things you shouldn't do, but, trying to say, for the reasons John said, that resources are limited, and these are based on the current state of knowledge at the time we did it, these are the things that, warrant the most attention right now. So, we're not talking about something that's never been done before. So you could go back and look at what happened before. if it turns out that it was useless, then we don't need to waste our time doing it. But I recall the first one, which is something I was pushing a long, long time ago, was where we seemed to be being driven by what compounds there was a lot of data on rather than what compounds were of potential public health impact to health.
This is Jim Behrman. Dr. Anastasio, we can work with John Boudreau and his staff and put together an informational item for the board in terms of their priorities for future health values that are being looked at. I mainly wanted to come back to just a process question or a process point that, as you were suggesting, and I think we'll work with you to designate a couple panel members, 2 or 3 panel members, to work on an initial letter whatever form it takes after working with our legal staff. The other point I wanted to make is I do not believe we're prepared to respond today, but I did want to make sure we have acknowledged, as you did earlier, the receipt of 2 sets of comments that came in just within the last day in one comment and within the last 2 days for the other comment. We're not prepared to respond in detail today, but staff will be reviewing those comments and providing some input to you, the panel, for discussion in your next meeting, tentatively in February of next year. But that discussion would be feeding into the initial letter of support then.
Yes, thank you, Jim.
Stop calling it a letter of support,
please.
Interim findings.
Thank you.
It'll be a letter of interim findings.
Yeah, on these public comments, and I'm perfectly happy to have some presentation on them, but I think we need to make it clear to the public that if they want their comments discussed in a sensible way, they can't send them in the day before the meeting. I mean, it's not fair to the agency, and it's not fair to the committee. I mean, these are very complex issues, and to have the most expeditious impact, they should have come in early enough for the agency to respond to them and then get the usual package to us where we had the comments and the responses to discuss. So this bringing these things in at the last possible second, it's actually not in industry's best interest, I don't think. So I think we want to, I mean, people are free to send in letters anytime they want, but I think, it ought to be made clear that to get on the agenda for a reasonable discussion, they need to come in enough in advance.
This is Jim.
Discussion.
This is Jim Behrman. I agree with you, Dr. Glantz. It's a balance. I think while we do not prefer the comments coming in at the last minute, I think we recognize the complexity of what's being looked at and what's being considered here. And I think we want to encourage input from the public and from other stakeholders. So rather than designating a specific hard and fast deadline, we've tried to be more flexible. And I think...
I think it's fine the way you're handling it. It's fine, as long as we don't, I just don't want to hear anything more about them today, other than, yes, we received them. So, Court, are we, just to get a sense, are we moving towards adjournment?
Yes, just have one other agenda item, but first, we didn't quite finish the question to the other panel members about the interim finding letter. Are there any panel members who disagree with that idea? Okay, if not, then we'll move forward with that, and we'll work over email to come up with some leads for that, who can work with staff to draft that letter. So that brings me to consideration of administration matters, agenda item number 2. 2 items here. One is I just want to remind everyone that our next in-person meeting, our next meeting period, will be in person on Thursday, February 27th. So please make sure that your calendar reflects that. And Lori and or Jim will be polling soon to set up the meeting after that. And then the last item is something Jim's already done. Actually, I just want to welcome formally Lori Miyasoto as the new panel liaison. And we're looking forward to working with you, Lori. And you can see how much fun these meetings are. So that will bring a little, spring in your step. No doubt about it.
Thank you very much, Court. I look forward to working with the entire panel. Thanks.
That's great. Thank you, Lori. With that, I would be happy to look for a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
Second.
Paul Blanc.
All right. Thank you, everyone.
All right. Thanks, everyone, and we look forward to seeing you in February.
Okay.
And
Bye.
happy Thanksgiving to all.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving.
Bye-bye.
Yeah, happy Thanksgiving. True.
Bye, everyone.
Okay, thanks all.
And